Germany, of course, is one of the United States' staunchest allies, one of the most important connections that we have in so many realms. Our relationship is built very much upon shared values that go back to the founding of our republic and even before. Democracy, respect for human rights, the rule of law, and very much the rules-based international order that Secretary Blinken has spoken of so many times recently. This is the network of institutions, rules, laws, practices that were built up in the last 75 years in the post-war era. We built a region of stability in the European transatlantic space that led to peace and incredible prosperity across 7 decades. Many challenges, many times we have had differences over the years, but continuing to strengthen our relationship has been a top priority, certainly of President Biden's administration in these 100 days. Very much part of the larger goal of repairing relationships and revitalizing the transatlantic partnership. And indeed, thinking about new ways, challenging ourselves to think about what we can do together. Increasing cooperation with our NATO allies. Secretary Blinken has been twice to Brussels, to the NATO ministerial in March, and then just a couple of weeks ago for the extraordinary North Atlantic Council meeting that was held to discuss Afghanistan after the president's decision there. On both occasions, he's had an opportunity to meet, of course, with German Foreign Minister Maas, as well as other allies. And all of these steps at revitalizing, reviewing all of the important things we share and need to work on are crucial. Most importantly, because our economies are so interrelated. And in this era of COVID, not only do we have to focus on the vaccination program, dealing with the pandemic, but the economic consequences and the way forward economically after this really catastrophic 14 months now. It's all interconnected, of course, and with Germany as the world's 4th largest economy, the biggest US trading partner in Europe, some $190 billion in goods in 2019 alone. And then if you start looking at foreign direct investment between our two countries, it's responsible for millions of jobs in both countries, companies that are working seamlessly between Germany and the United States, and of course, the broader EU relationship. In security, there is no doubt that Germany is a leading partner in Europe, host to major US commands, including the US European Command, the US Africa Command. You heard that I spent some time in Stuttgart at US EUCOM and had an opportunity during those years to engage with many of you. Our servicemen and women, along with their families, of course, have built lasting ties over generations in Germany. Our force posture, which is once again in a more, shall we say, calm, reviewed situation, is vitally important to us moving forward. Politically, of course, Germany is a leader in the EU, and we were talking before the program began about what an important this is politically for Germany. We in the State Department, of course, are watching very closely as you move toward the elections this fall. I think even more so after Brexit, Germany is such a critical leader within the EU and one that we count on in terms of sharing our fundamental values and interests. Deepening and expanding cooperation is clearly a priority for the Biden administration. We've used these 100 days to have a thorough review of many of our policies, a lot of engagement transatlantic, whether it's the limited travel we've been able to do during the pandemic or the regular phone calls and engagements that we have bilaterally and in multilateral fora. You'll recall that Secretary Blinken joined the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU early on to meet with all of his EU counterparts. We've had these NATO engagements. We've revitalized our engagement at the OSCE, which is so crucial for problems all throughout the OSCE space. And I think that's important as we look toward the next few years, as we march toward the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act and the fundamental principles on which OSCE is based. We are, of course, working on climate, COVID, and China, the three big C's that President Biden has talked about. Bringing an end to the COVID pandemic is the priority, and facilitating stable and sustainable economic recovery is something we have to focus on. But we've got to be realistic about some of the threats that we face. NATO is the concrete manifestation, the backbone of the transatlantic alliance and our unity, and we believe remains indispensable as a forum for consultation and decision on matters of collective security. It has been the most successful alliance, I think, perhaps in history. It is a defensive alliance. We have to always remember that, despite some of the Russian disinformation. And the United States has led and invested in NATO and in readiness, in enhancing deterrence, our defense capabilities, in light of the current strategic environment, in light of the threats we see from Russia. Also, the challenges we see from China. We do, of course, continue to encourage Germany and our other NATO allies to invest in their own defense capabilities and modernize their militaries, keeping with the commitments that have been made. But I think we can do that in a very fundamental spirit of cooperation that is appropriate for the alliance. We need capable partners, just as Germany needs capable partners. And we want to work and make sure that allies provide the capabilities that NATO needs. The NATO 2030 initiative and the recommendations that the Secretary General has made, I think, are going to be vital, and we'll be focusing on those as we prepare for the NATO summit to be held in June. President Biden, of course, has announced that he will travel to Brussels for that event, to be joined by the 29 other leaders of the NATO member countries. I think NATO-EU cooperation remains a priority for the United States. We appreciate very much the assistance of Germany in working on participation by non-EU allies in, for instance, the Dutch-led military mobility project under the PESCO framework. And we do hope that Germany will support our efforts to establish an administrative arrangement between the United States and the European Defense Agency, which is required for participation in many other projects. We believe we're doing our part. I think you would have seen just in the last week or two, the German Defense Minister, Kramp-Karrenbauer, and Defense Secretary Austin announced deployment of an additional 500 troops in Wiesbaden. This, I think, speaks to the level of partnership and commitment, again, after some years of concern, poor communication, and indeed a period that we're trying to now put in context. We talked about Afghanistan, and we were very clear, as the two ministers were, that we went into Afghanistan together in 2001 after the attacks on the United States on 9/11. We've been working side by side for 20 years. We adjusted together, and we will leave together. And of course, that's what was discussed after President Biden made his decision. And all allies, you'll have seen in Brussels, came together to embrace that decision and are working now on the next steps to remove troops from Afghanistan. So again, NATO, I think, remains a tangible manifestation of the transatlantic link. And there's no other organization that unites us in terms of collective defense and preservation of the peace and security in that transatlantic space. I do think President Biden has gone out of his way, whether it's at Munich or joining the European Council, and the phone calls he's had with counterparts, including Chancellor Merkel, to underscore his core belief that American leadership and engagement matters in the world. As he said, America is back. We are determined to repair those relationships where we feel there's been some fraying on the edges, and work for common goals. It doesn't mean we won't have differences. And as we look at the strategic environment, I think we have to recognize new and traditional strategic competitors. As I said, preserving the rules-based order is the priority for us. That's something in which the United States for generations has been invested. And while those rules may need to adapt at times to deal with new threats, new opportunities, new technologies, there's a lot to be focused on there. You look at Russia remaining the most immediate threat to our collective security, something that we discuss, of course, very closely with Germany as well as with other allies. Moscow seeks a hegemony over the former Soviet space. We've seen that just in the last few weeks with their enormous buildup of troops threatening Ukraine, where we already know they have undertaken some of the most fundamental violations of the basic principles under the Helsinki Final Act in terms of occupying Crimea, in terms of fomenting a military threat that has cost thousands of lives in the Donbass. It doesn't mean that we don't seek to have a more predictable, productive relationship with Russia. In fact, one of the first things President Biden undertook when he came into office was to extend the New START treaty with Russia and demonstrate that we could do that on the one hand, but also take a very careful look at the areas where Russia had been meddling in our affairs, whether it was our elections, whether it was hacking through the Solar Winds case, whether it was offering bounties on our soldiers in Afghanistan, and very carefully analyzing and taking steps, as he said, to impose costs on Moscow and on the Putin regime for the behavior that they choose to undertake. We watch the military buildup that Putin has undertaken not only around Ukraine, but in the Baltic Sea, in the Black Sea, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the high north, the Arctic. These are important strategic issues for us. The disinformation on which Russia engages, the malign influence operations are serious. The cyber attacks, increasingly sophisticated, you know in Germany as well, that this is a real threat. And you have taken steps in Germany to impose a cost on Russia for that. We'll continue to monitor together, to share information and experiences on this. I think the German public is well aware of some of the activities, including assassinations near the Bundestag. We have to be aware of Russia's efforts to drive wedges between and among allies, between Europe and North America, and between and among European Union member states as well. These are issues, of course, where we often find challenges. One I have to mention, and we can get into later, of course, is the Nord Stream 2 project, which President Biden has been very clear he sees as a bad deal, as a real challenge, a product of Russian malign influence, seeking to divide Europe, exposing Ukraine and Central Europe to threats, undermining energy security. And yet this is something that we have to work on together because we have so many other important things to do as well. Let me just say a few words about China. The People's Republic of China is a full spectrum, long-term strategic competitor. And again, I think we were making these points in many ways, whether it was 5G or highlighting some of the other actions by China, the cheating in terms of the international order, the theft of intellectual property that costs billions for those of us in countries that develop new technologies, for instance. That's what we want to address. And so we're prepared to compete with China when appropriate, cooperate with China if we can, and contest China in that space where we feel they are violating the international order. Of course, it's not an immediate military threat to the transatlantic area on the scale of Russia, but China is expanding its military reach into the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and even in the high north, and seeding its technologies in critical infrastructure as well as intellectual property theft, as I mentioned. We were disappointed to see German officials and entities targeted by China in retaliation for the EU's principled opposition to human rights violations and abuses against Muslim Uyghurs, for instance, and other minorities in Xinjiang, what they've done in Hong Kong. And so there are many aspects to our engagement with partners like Germany and the EU on China. In fact, we've relaunched under the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken, the US-EU dialogue on China. We hope to have a kickoff event at a relatively high level soon to look at these different challenges with China, different aspects of our relationship with China, the challenges and opportunities. And that gives us something to compare notes on. We won't always agree fully, but as strong allies with the history we have and the fundamental principles and values, I think we have opportunities there. I'll just note a few other points that I think are important to keep in mind as we think about US, Germany, and the bridges between our two countries. Climate change poses one of the greatest long-term challenges to the United States and to Europe and to the world. And of course, President Biden rejoined the Paris Accords. He's hosted world leaders, including Chancellor Merkel, for a leaders summit on climate just last week. And it's a part that we have to calculate in as NATO allies as well. Terrorism remains an important factor, something we have to keep an eye on, although we've come out of 2 decades, 20 years really, where we've focused on global terrorist threats, perhaps sometimes to the detriment, our own detriment, by letting other challenges like the China challenge, like climate, go to the wayside. We can talk more about NATO in 2030 and the recommendations there, the way forward, if there's interest in that. I'll just close by underscoring that at its core, NATO, of course, is an alliance of democracies. And as I've said already, shared values, rule of law, democracy, and individual liberty are those key values. If we want to strengthen NATO, if we want to preserve this space of unprecedented peace and stability and then prosperity that we've had essentially since 1945, we need to attend to those values. We need to be ever vigilant about it. And we've learned some lessons here in the United States too. And I know many of my European friends have watched with great concern about some of the developments in our country, including January 6th. We've reached another point where we have to think about political cohesion as allies, and yet look at our own challenges. I always say, it's a cliche at this point, America was founded to be a more perfect union, but never have we said that it's perfect or that the process of forming that is done. So we continue to have work to do. We can do it best when we deal with it honestly, courageously, and of course, strategically with our partners and allies, of which Germany is one of the most important. So thanks again for this opportunity. I'll stop there and turn it over to Anna, and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Reeker, for those very encouraging remarks, I must say. Questions keep coming in. I just would like to start off with 2 questions for myself and then hand it over to our viewers. The first, being a journalist, I of course can't resist to ask you about some recent news. And we've all, with quite some tension, have followed the events in Ukraine and at the Ukrainian border. What do you make of the Russian troop movements and the withdrawal that has been announced? And could you say something about how the US see Europe's role in this conflict, which we had to learn is not a cold conflict at all?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for bringing that up. Ukraine obviously was a major topic alongside Afghanistan when we all met at NATO a couple of weeks ago. We saw the largest buildup of Russian troops and equipment along Ukraine's borders and inside Ukraine, because of course Crimea is Ukraine. The largest buildup since 2014, when they undertook the invasion And of course, we've had 7 years of efforts, many led by Germany and France through the Normandy format, to implement the Minsk agreements. That has not proved successful. You see a tremendous disinformation effort on the part of the Russians. They were pushing narratives of provocations by the Ukrainians. And instead, we really focused on what we saw as great restraint by President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. There was a lot of projection by the Kremlin of what they, in fact, were doing onto the Ukrainians, perhaps hoping that they would goad them into some action, taking the bait, as we say. What we have seen is, a pullback. Some troops have returned to garrison. An awful lot of equipment remains in place. There are real questions about what is the intent of Putin. None of this matches exactly the narrative that emerged after some time that, this was just about preparing for exercises. So we'll have to see where this goes. But I think President Biden made very clear that we are committed to Ukraine, to its sovereignty, to its territorial integrity, as a partner and a friend, and we look forward to further engagements with Ukraine to demonstrate that. And of course, we do this not only with Ukraine, but with partners like Germany, France, the United Kingdom, all of our NATO allies, in standing up for Ukraine, because that again is part of the shared values that we have. Ukraine has a lot of work to do on its own in terms of dealing with its reform agenda, dealing with oligarchs, dealing with the challenges they face also with the pandemic. So that is an unfinished story, and we have to keep a close eye on it.
And my second question before we get to the views question would be on a term that Antony Blinken, for example, has used a lot. I think I haven't heard it in your remarks, but the foreign policy for the American middle class. So what exactly does it mean, and how could it play out in the context of transatlantic relations?
I think it's a great term, and obviously it emerged in the Biden Harris campaign. I think it's something that Secretary Blinken takes very seriously every day as we look at how we not only engage and implement the administration's foreign policies, but how we explain them to the American people. That's always a challenge in foreign policy. We that have been practitioners now, myself for almost 30 years, my area of focus for a long time in my career was what we call public diplomacy. And we have to do that at home as well. We have to help Americans understand why our engagement in foreign wars, perhaps in Afghanistan, in alliances, in negotiations, why that is important and how it affects their very lives and livelihoods. The world is a globalized world. We can't escape that. And yet we have to help people understand why what we're doing in terms of foreign policy, in terms of diplomacy, actually matters to the average American. And so a foreign policy for the middle class that tries to utilize the institutions that I talked about in terms of the international order, the rules-based order, for free trade, for promoting economic cooperation, for dealing with threats and challenges. That's what that's about. And I think we have always a lot of work to do in trying to help explain that. We have to start with our Congress and various publics, but groups like Atlantik-Brücke are very helpful with that as well.
I will maybe start with a question that came via the chat on China, and you've said a few words about this difficult, challenging relationship. The viewer asks how big a role China plays in the ability of Europe and the US to resolve some internal transatlantic issues. And maybe I can add to that. Could you say a few words on how you view the decision of the EU and China to have signed the comprehensive investment agreement just before the Biden administration came into office?
I'll start with that because the last question is always the easiest one to take. There were some raised eyebrows. Some people, both from the old administration and the new, questioned why that was done then. But I think we also could put that in context. It had been a a priority during the German presidency of the EU. Calendars are important. For us, what was important was that we reinitiate a strong dedication to consultation and coordination with our allies, including Germany. And that's been a first priority in how we approach the People's Republic of China and some of their abusive economic practices, their human rights violations, their attempts to undermine this rules-based international order that we've talked about. There are challenges too, of course, to shared security and the very democratic values that are the basis of the transatlantic partnership. That includes, privacy and issues tied to technology. The whole discussion about the 5G networks, for all of the neuralgia that generated over the past couple of years, has in fact produced a kind of meeting of minds generally to realize what these threats are about. And for our part, it was trying to share with partners, friends, allies, why we were concerned. We came late to this game, understanding that certain hardware and networks could be used by the People's Republic of China. Companies from China are essentially arms of the Communist Party, of the People's Liberation Army. And we came late to that realization. In our country too, we have Huawei equipment throughout networks across the United States. We needed to share that and help people understand this wasn't a push on our part. We don't have producers of 5G network equipment, but as we've often said, we'd much rather work with a Nokia or an Ericsson because we understand that those companies are independent and based in countries where there is a fundamental respect for rule of law and shared values. More broadly, I think on China, the onus is going to be on China, including with the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. The onus will be on China to follow through on the pledges. What about forced labor, state-owned enterprises, subsidies? We'll wait and see. I don't think that story is finished, and I suspect there'll be increasing attention paid to that in the years ahead. While the U.S. relationship with China is increasingly competitive, I think indeed sometimes adversarial, it's also important to know that there are cooperative aspects. And if you look back at the history of China's emergence, it was the United States, some would argue rightly, wrongly, that helped China emerge through opening to China. Nixon to China some decades ago, the idea being, of course, that if you lifted up their economy, you brought millions and millions of people out of poverty, that democracy might follow. On that, we were wrong. And it is a different approach, and we'll just have to continue to look where we can engage with them, for instance, on climate. And certainly we're trying through the president's initiatives, and Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, has been already to China. We need to engage them. The size of their economy, the size of their population and their landmass, they have to play a role in dealing with the climate challenge.
The next question is from Martin Frost. What is your view of the role of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe? I think you have said it is crucial, but could you say a few words more?
No, I'm glad you bring it up, Martin, because I'm a strong believer in the OSCE. And I'm very sorry that due to COVID, we weren't able to travel earlier this year while the United States, chaired the Forum for Security and Cooperation, which, given 57 participating states, you sort of get this chance to chair that once every 18 years or something. So we did chair that. We focused on some of the issues like Ukraine. We've done a lot of work there on the Caucasus issues, which are important. Again, OSCE is a structure that was created in the days of the Cold War, frankly, where we could agree, as Russia and all of the successor states of the Soviet Union did, on a set of fundamental principles. What we do see is that a number of those states, led by Russia, but a few others as well, consistently violate or fail to live up to those principles, fail to live up to the Helsinki Final Act, even as we see it approaching its 50th anniversary. We need to use that as a platform for engagement. I think in some cases, what I've seen over the years is more and more political and non-military issues moving into the NATO platform. And perhaps we should move some of those back to OSCE. We're delighted to have the Swiss chairmanship in office. Secretary Blinken spoke to, the Swedish chairman in office spoke to Ann Linde, the Swedish foreign minister, in one of his earliest calls, just to underscore, of course, our bilateral relationship with Sweden, but the important role they're playing at the OSCE. We got a new leadership slate in place. I worked very hard personally recently to make sure that the special monitoring mission that the OSCE provides for Donbass and in Ukraine was extended. It's not only its mandate, but its budget, because we felt that was very important. And presciently, I think, since we saw the challenges that Russia has posed all over the OSCE space, there are projects, whether it's election monitoring through ODIHR, well, it's freedom of the media, whether it's the Commissioner for National Minorities. These are important institutions. They're part of the structures we've created to try to deal with issues peacefully. Often maddeningly challenging, if you think about Nagorno-Karabakh and the 30 years of the Minsk Group co-chair process, which we are one of the co-chairs, along with Russia and France. But better to have a process and to have a structure, an institution to deal with these things than to let it run the course as wars and other things used to develop before the post-war era.
I'll maybe take a few questions on trade next. One question is, when do you expect US borders to open again for German investors? And then, of course, I would have asked that too, the TTIP question. After TTIP failed, what will be the requirement for a new trade agreement between the US and the EU?
I don't want to sound like I'm running away from it, but truly, these trade issues don't belong to us in the State Department. Fundamentally, as part of our broad foreign policy, we include trade, but our U.S. trade representative is in charge of that. So I get in trouble if I veer into that space too much. I think it is going to be very important to look again at trade and whether we can achieve some sort of comprehensive transatlantic trade. We've taken some steps early in the new administration to deal with some of these tariff issues that emerged in the last administration, the Airbus Boeing, for instance, suspending those for a period of time to try to find some solutions. These are things I think, again, we can talk about. They will be tense, they are difficult. There are member states in the EU who have agricultural policies that are strongly opposed to opening markets. And it will take a fair amount of work. Again, that reminds you that the list of things we have to do and have to focus on is very long. And I do think as we emerge from COVID, where the real focus has been for these 100 days, along with things like arms control and all the other things we have to deal with, crises as they emerge, economic recovery in the post-COVID world will require some focus on trade and investment. One big step will be once we can start reopening for travel. We've seen some suggestions about the EU opening up for American visitors. Obviously, tourism plays an important part there, but I know it's been a struggle for businesses and investors at the same time. We've tried to have a variety of programs for national interest waivers to the travel bans that were put in place because of COVID. Those are far from perfect. I'm getting the feeling that in our country, as the vaccination program takes over, as we see some new CDC regulations about mask wearing and other steps, we will get there slowly. But this isn't going to be in the next weeks. I think we're talking months, but it is very much on the minds of people at the very highest levels.
I think I'd like to take next question on Iran and the Middle East in a broader sense. The question comes from Michael Schäfer, who says he has been part of the difficult negotiations for the Iran deal. And he asks, how will it go on? And he mentions that from his point of view, it can't be all, or the politics and the reason can't be all about just the nuclear issue, but maybe a broader stance should be taken involving actors like Saudi Arabia and Israel. So how far would you go to involve those actors, his question is, and how would you engage in such a process with the European Union?
You're going to get a little outside of my mandate, and again, I try to be careful about that. I think fundamentally I can say we are committed to ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. We're also committed to seeing diplomacy in coordination with allies and regional partners as the best path to achieve that goal. So you have seen Rob Malley, who's leading the team in Vienna for these proximity talks that have been held under the auspices of the EU. I can't really give you any particular readouts on that process. Wendy Sherman is on board now for about a week as the Deputy Secretary of State. She, of course, was very involved in the JCPOA negotiations some years ago under the Obama administration. And we very much are pursuing the path of meaningful diplomacy. So we have people in place that know and are familiar intimately with what the JCPOA was, how it was reached, and are dedicated, with Rob Malley leading a team, with the secretary very focused on this, to achieve a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA, and then intend to build on that to lengthen and strengthen the constraints on Iran's nuclear program, but also, as you indicate, address other issues of concern. Fundamental problems that we have with Iran's behavior and actions across a whole range of issues: support for terrorism, the ballistic missile program, destabilizing actions throughout the region where they channel their resources away from the Iranian people into destabilizing other governments, sponsoring terrorism, and really the abhorrent practices of what they do to detained Americans as well as other detained Westerners as political tools. So, our fundamental basis is that Iran, with a nuclear weapon, is likely to act even more provocatively than it does even now, and has continued to do. In that regard, we will consult particularly with the P5+1 partners, and with Israel, and with the regional partners, which, as you indicate, are important on this, in determining the best way forward to deal with these very complicated threats and challenges that have been around for a long time and are not easily resolved. But I think there's a real dedication to doing that, again, in cooperation and consultation with partners and allies.
Yes, Foreign Minister Heiko Maas just said yesterday that he is very content to have those very intense conversations and interview Germany. The next question comes from Heinrich Kraft, who asks about Nord Stream, of course. Do you see a possibility to turn Nord Stream 2 into an asset of European energy security and into a tool to influence Russian behavior?
It's a tough one because it is a complex issue. We believe that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea. The president has said that. We've talked about that from both sides of our political spectrum, of course. And the secretary has emphasized, including in our very cordial and very productive bilateral meetings with Heiko Maas on that point. Clearly, we have a difference. The president opposes it and we will continue to do so. I think, again, you have to go back to the basic way we see this, and this predates even the previous administration. This was something we raised during the Obama years. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline as a project is an effort of Russian malign influence, in our view. It threatens European energy security, certainly that of Ukraine and the eastern flank allies in NATO. And the administration remains committed. Indeed, we have laws that we have to uphold, passed by Congress, to use all available tools to stop Nord Stream 2 from being completed. So companies risk sanctions if they're involved in Nord Stream 2. This is not something that we take lightly, and we continue to look for ways that we can find a way forward on this, at the same time making sure that we can compartmentalize, because we have many other things that we need to focus on with Germany and other allies at the same time. So this story is not over. I would ask sometimes the same of our German friends. What do you recommend? How do you see a way forward in this? And I think we'll have to continue. But our point has been very clear and has not changed since the president, both in his campaign and since taking office 100 days ago.
There are a few more questions from viewers. I'd like to ask you one myself again. It's on the elections in Germany, and we've talked a little bit about it beforehand, that you said that Americans just realized that there is something going on, or like the average American in Germany. So how do you follow this? What are the expectations and maybe concerns that you, from the State Department's view, have with the election in September?
Well, first I'd say, we watch elections for myself and my colleagues at the European Bureau. We have, as I said, 50 countries that we look at. I think we have every confidence and faith in the German electoral system, be free, fair elections. But the outcome is clearly far from certain, at least from the news I read and the analysis that I see. Our embassy on the ground in Berlin and our 5 consulates throughout Germany obviously report, like every other diplomatic post does, on what they see. We see media analysis, we read your pieces, and we'll be very interested to see the outcome. We now seem to have candidates, at least from the main parties. You see here in our media a lot of discussion about the rise of the Green Party. That's simply a phenomenon that's been covered. Just as you watched our elections, there is a great focus on polling data and keeping track of who's up, who's down. This is a particularly poignant election because after 16 years of Angela Merkel as chancellor, there will be this major change. And first and foremost, it's a change for Germany and Germans, but obviously it'll be a change for the rest of us as well. I'm confident that whatever the outcome, that we will be able to work closely with our German partners and allies in the period as a new government is formed after those elections. So we'll keep watching closely.
Are there any concerns that if it were a government led by the Greens, that Germany may cut its defense spending or at least stop increasing it? And then, of course, Annalena Baerbock is on the record saying that nuclear sharing should be stopped and American nuclear weapons be withdrawn from Germany. Is that a scenario you're looking at?
I think as a diplomat, I don't know how smart I am, but I'll leave that to our analysis. We listen, we watch, and we will work with whatever government is formed, as we always have over the years, and obviously make clear our priorities, our interests. I think, again, our relationship with Germany is so multifaceted and so important in every sector. And as you know from watching our elections, there are elections, there are candidates, they have platforms, things are said. We'll just have to see what the results are and go from there.
I'll go back to the views questions. Tara Haran is curious about your views on Europe's recent push for strategic autonomy. How do you interpret the term?
It's an interesting question, Anna, because I often say, what does that mean? And I don't always get the same answer from any European, from any particular expert. There are different interpretations, different views. So I tend myself not to get too obsessed over it. As I tried to say in my remarks and in some of this discussion, for us, NATO and what we created in terms of a security alliance that has great political aspects and of course has provided the stability necessary for economic prosperity is the backbone and is what's important for us. And what we don't want to see is anything that undermines or countermands NATO's unified efforts. So we've encouraged EU efforts. Anything that contributes to our overall security is important, but it should be done very much in unison. So we encourage very much NATO-EU security discussions, and we watch that, of course, very closely. I had this opportunity to be the deputy to the commander of U.S. European Command, who also is double-hatted, as you know, as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe under the NATO framework. So it was a very interesting perspective to see how we coordinate our own posture in Europe. And that's a vast space, of course, right to the Eastern Mediterranean, how we deal with threats in the north, in the Arctic, the high north. There's just a lot of work there. And I just don't get too focused on this concept of strategic autonomy. I'm still waiting for someone to define exactly what is meant by that. And in fact, I think often there are a variety of meanings.
And then last question from the viewers, because our time is coming to a close, from Init Adla, and he asks about the International Criminal Court and asks, will the US, after 4 years of actions against the court, once again have an observer delegation at the Assembly of States, Parties, and support rule of law and the heinous crimes under the jurisdiction of the ICC?
Simple answer, again, I always hate to dodge is I don't have an answer for you yet on that part of it. You will have seen that we removed some sanctions that have been put in place by the previous administration on some of the officials of the ICC through a presidential action. But I'm sure our team, as it continues to fill out, our undersecretaries and assistant secretaries come in place, we'll look at that as the administration continues in this first 100 days and now into the next 100 days to review all of these policies and make determinations accordingly.
And you have addressed it in your speech, but my last question, I would like to raise climate change again. So we've had the summit last week. What's your conclusion? Was it a success? And what's the US's way forward to the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow? What's your goals there?
No, I think it's a great question, a good way to wrap up, because the summit was a really key milestone. The fact that we put this together in 100 days, the president had indicated in the campaign that he wanted to do this, that we would rejoin the Conference of Parties, the Paris process, but that we would have this Leaders Summit early on. That was really an important milestone on the road to the 26th COP, the Conference of Parties, that'll be held in Glasgow in November. That's under the UN framework for climate change. And of course, we've reinvigorated our engagement at the UN. We are rejoining the Human Rights Council as well. I think we'll see that the Major Economies Forum, I think it's called, MEF, on energy and climate has been reconvened, and we're part of that as well. A U.S.-led initiative there. And the president really was able to bring together important stakeholders, Vladimir Putin, the Chinese, from all around the world, to have a conversation about the importance of this and to demonstrate that the U.S. is back on this front, that we have put this at the top of the agenda. The climate is critical. Many of these countries have demonstrated leadership even during the period where we were outside this climate framework. And so the focus now is charting paths towards a net zero carbon economy. I think we endorsed this even at NATO, at the ministerial. The secretary joined with the other ministers to endorse a NATO climate change agenda, establishing a new baseline within the alliance on that. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in the climate realm. We are going to play a leadership role. We're demonstrating that, but again, we want to do it with partners. And I think that'll be very much a story of not just the political angle and the economics, but the innovation and the capturing technology and how we use that to deal with climate change, reduce the carbon emissions, and part of this whole infrastructure rebuilding, sort of green economy, is going to be a very important topic.
Ambassador Reeker, thank you so very much for your time. I will close here and just hand it back very briefly to Stephen. And thanks, and also thanks a lot for the great questions from our viewers.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You. Yes, and let me just echo what Anna said. Phil Reeker, in your remarks and in the discussion with Anna Sauerbrey, you touched on a lot of the difficult, gnarly issues that the US and Europe have in common. You certainly outlined an ambitious agenda, one that's full of challenges, but I think, in light of the way you outlined it and presented it, one that's full of opportunities for greater transatlantic cooperation. And so I really want to thank you for this positive outlook on what the US and Europe can do together to meet the global challenges of today. I want to thank you for engaging in this discussion with Atlantik-Brücke and the American Council on Germany. And of course, Anna, to you, thank you for leading the discussion. We're grateful to you both for taking the time. So on behalf of both Atlantik-Brücke and the ACG, thank you all for attending. Thank you for the great questions. And to everybody who's on this Zoom call, stay well.
See you on the other side of the bridge.
Many thanks from Berlin as well. Bye-bye.